Hey everyone, welcome to 2068, the foundations of a planetary civilization. So hopefully this video is going to explain why 2068, why that date's important, and what exactly the foundations of a planetary civilization are. So at the moment, the world is going, there's a 30-year journey from 2015 to 2030. This is a journey that's been set by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, there's 17 of them. And the idea is that they're a continuation of the Millennium Development Goals started in 2000 to 2015. So it's a pretty 15-year trajectory. The idea for 2068 is to give us a bigger picture and to give us a grand vision of where we're headed. So the start is 1968. The Apollo 8 crew took the first picture of the planet with human hands. And before 1968, this was the image of the planet, and it still is, and that's the problem. It's a flat land of two-dimensional proportions. It's countries, nation-states, essentially vying for resources and power. And this is getting us into all sorts of trouble. And in 1968, on the way to the moon, the Apollo 8 turned around and they took this picture. A very different image. This image is constructed. This is the world that we have constructed. This is the real world, biophysical planet. And, it's a starting point. This is the first time we saw ourselves in that way. So, starting point is 1968, the ending is 2068. We are in the middle. And the middle allows us, it's a midpoint which allows us to look back at this anniversary, so it gives us a reason to go to places and talk about Apollo 8 and Earthrise, because we're commemorating the 50 years, but it also gives us an opportunity to look forward 50 years at 2068. And the idea here is that by looking forward at 2068, we are able to take that as a visionary moment and a visionary point of where we're headed and to turn back to 2018. And we reframe the Sustainable Development Goals in that larger narrative. So we backcast from 2068, which is the vision we want to head to. Suddenly the 17 goals of 2030 seem so important, and we go back to 2018 or our present day. So the big issue here is what I call the Zen horse problem. The Zen horse problem is it's taken from a parable in Japan. From the Zen tradition, there's a guy standing on the side of the road. There's a horse galloping towards him. And he looks to the rider of the horse and he shouts, "Hey, where are you going?" And as the guy goes past him, he shouts, "I don't know, ask the horse." And the idea is, in the Zen tradition, the horse is our mind. But in our context, the horse is our global civilization and we are the rider. This horse is riding off into the sunset. We have no idea where it's going. And so 2068 is to answer this problem. Where are we going? And the idea is hopefully we shift from this perspective, this sort of limited flat land, to this perspective. And to create, the beginnings of something new and a civilization founded on this principle. And what would that look like? So that essentially 2068 is a starting point and not an end. It's a countdown to the beginnings of a new type of civilization. And we are over the next 50 years have to lay those foundations down. Now the Sustainable Development Goals are super important. They're part of that foundation, but we need to go beyond that, and we need to really give people a goal. Where's the horse going? And this is the working definition, I think, of where we need to be headed. And it's 3 parts: a planetary civilization for a stabilized world population, living in abundance within planetary boundaries. And I'm going to break down those 3 key aspects and what they mean. So a planetary civilization, a planetary operating system, however we want to call it, it's a civilization that's based upon this image of the planet, and this image is embedded within it. So what does that look like? Well, those of us who've seen the planet from space remark on its beauty and the overview effect that Frank White coined, and all of these ideas of interconnection and long-term thinking. But the thing that is actually, I think, the most obvious thing, which sounds so obvious it's not worth saying, is that when you look back at the planet, you see the planet. you don't see the global economy. This is the primary system. This is what this is what is the thing that underlies everything else, the planet. And in turn, we can see that we're a species that's part of that planet, and in turn, that species has created a global civilization, but in our context, a global economy. So this miraculous thing happens, though. When you land, the spaceship lands and you get out, it's precisely the opposite. What you see is the global economy is the primary system, and everything is a subsidiary of that. So you have this sort of strange situation where you go from space, seeing the planet, and part of that is society and economy, and it flips, and you end up in this sort of strange situation where, you see this strange situation where you end up going, in the opposite direction. So what we have to do, the idea here for planetary civilization, is to just have a civilization based on the reality of the world, not based upon some misconception of things. So that's it, planetary civilization, or the flip, as we've been talking about. So, planetary society, economy, not the other way around, economy, society, planet. So a stabilized world population, what does this mean? Well, this work is taken from Jonas Salk's work and his son Jonathan. Jonas Salk cured polio. He's a great hero, obviously, back in 1954. Towards the end of his life, he ended up thinking about world population, got obsessed with this sigmoid curve. And this is the second part of it. If the flip is the first part, this is the second part. The sigmoid curve's made up of two parts, an accelerator and a decelerator. This applies to world population, of course. So here's world population, Black Plague. 1804 we hit 1 billion. 1927 we hit 2 billion here, and then boom, we start shooting up to 7.5 billion. And this is the hockey stick. World population is shooting up. We have no idea where we're going. Well, most people actually have an idea of where we're going. They think it's just going to collapse, and we're going to return back to this tiny 250, 500 million people stabilized world population. This is a very depressing, misanthropic vision of the world. This is not. This is our population grows, and then we start to decelerate our birth and death rate, and we stabilize the world population. And we do that, and it looks like that's what's happening. It took 123 years, then 33, then 14, then 13 to add 1 billion. We've now got to the point where we've hit this inflection point in 2010, and it looks like world population is going to start to stabilize, and hopefully by 2100, this is the beginning of that stabilization. Now, it can happen. In lots of different ways, and you can either have 9 billion people, 14 billion people, what have you. But ultimately, from a long-term perspective, this is 16,000 year timeline. Here we are in the middle. From a long-term perspective, what this allows is a new stabilized world population, which is ultimately a new type of civilization. And we're in this sort of inflection point between these two epochs, which Salk he talks about this period as being divided by two: an accelerator, epoch A, decelerator, epoch B. And there's different ideas of values, behaviors, and worldview within those two different epochs. Epoch A is very much about power, competition, independence. Epoch B is far more about collaboration, interdependence, balance, and whole. And so, interestingly enough, when Salk came up with these ideas, that was the same sort of time that image came out of the planet. So, ultimately we've got this goal, which is to hit this stabilized population. And how does that happen? It happens very simply. You bring everyone out of poverty. You give everyone education. The main thing is female education in this, in terms of fertility. So there's lots of information on this which we can't go into. Different countries are at different periods of time. Hans Rohling's very famous talking about this. But one thing that really the big thing is you reduce mortality rates, overall mortality rates. If you reduce the death rate, the birth rate decreases. Reduce poverty, female education during the labour force, family planning. So basically all the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals, they actually have they're very pragmatic, which is it leads to population stabilisation. And Salk and his son Jonathan, they took these 3 periods of time. Period 1, which is pre-industrial, late agrarian period, 250 million people. That stretches back to our beginnings as human beings. Period 2, which is the epoch A and B, and then period 3. This is our goal, to get to a world population stabilized at that level. And where does that occur? Well, it needs to occur within planetary boundaries, which is our third part. So back in 2009, Nature published Jonas Rockström, or Jonan Rockström. Christoph, you have to help me. He's a Swedish scientist at the University of Stockholm. He created something called the Stockholm Resilience Center. And basically, he got 123 scientists together and said, what are the safe operating space for humanity in terms of planetary boundaries? And the way that he figured this out is he realized that the period of time that we're in now, the period of time that we were in, for 10,000 years, is called the Holocene, which means the new hole in Greek. It's part of the Cenozoic. This is the beginning this is the Earth. A billion years later, there's life. Lots of stuff going on, mass extinctions, but here's the Holocene. We're currently in a mass extinction. It's not a comet that caused it, like the last one 65 million years ago. Here, it's us, and we've moved out of the Holocene into, they call the Anthropocene, meaning we have taken over the conditions that regulate life. And what happens is that you get these these massive periods of time where you have an ice age basically for 100,000 years or so, and then interglacial periods where things are stable, and then ice age, interglacial. So the Holocene was this interglacial period 10,000 years ago that allowed our civilization to evolve. It allowed everything to happen. Our migration 200,000 years all out of Africa everywhere basically happened within an ice age, and it was pretty tough living. And then 10,000 years ago, everything stabilized. And what Rockström realized is that Holocene, the Holocene had these 9 key boundaries that were regulated, and we have now taken over those boundaries, and we've moved into the Anthropocene. So, very quickly, there's these 9 boundaries that we know about. Climate change, very clearly. There's a bunch of other ones. Ozone, for example, if you remember, it's a great success story that had massively crossed a boundary. We've globally regulated that. CFCs, refrigeration, what have you. And it's the same for a bunch of, these other quite relatively technical things. But ultimately, what he found is that there is a safe operating space. There is a place where humans can operate, where we don't take these huge risks that could completely destabilize the conditions that allow our civilization to function. So we want to maintain Holocene level levels within this boundary. So, this goes that Rockström basically evolved it. Growth without limits is, business as usual. Environmentalists came and said, okay, we need to have limits to growth, Club of Rome. And then growth within limits is essentially what we're talking about here. This is, we can grow, but we have to grow within this safe operating space. So that's it. You've got, basically we move from this image of the world to this image, which is the flip, and civilization that needs that. We have a stabilized world population, and that all happens within planetary boundaries. So, a planetary civilization for a stabilized world population living in abundance within planetary boundaries. This is where the horse, but going back to our Zen horse problem, when the rider shouts, we get to say, this is where we're headed. We are headed to 2068, and we're going to lay those foundations down. And so, essentially, hashtag 2068 becomes synonymous with where we need to be headed. And, we then get to turn around to the world and say, how do we get there? It's an open question for the world. How do we get to 2068? Big question for us is, how do we capture that response? Okay, thank you so much.